thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forever.
Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President.
I have a letter from Her Excellency the President dated 1st of May 2025, and it reads as follows. Dear Mr. President, I shall be away from the island on duty leave during the period 1st to 15th May 2025. In accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of the Constitution, the Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Douglas Gibson will perform the functions of the office of the President during my absence. As the Honorable the Senate will not be meeting prior to my departure, it will not be possible for the usual formal message to be sent to your chamber. Will you, therefore, please bring my absence formally to the attention of the Honorable the Senate when next it meets? Signed by Her Excellency the President at State House. I have further communication from State House from the Acting President dated 9th of May 2025. And it reads as follows. Dear Sir, I wish to inform that in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, under Section 39(1)(f) of the Constitution, the seat in the Senate held by Mr. Chad Jason Blackman was declared vacant with effect from 5th of May 2025, signed by the Acting President at State House.
Announcement by Your Honor.
Announcements. First of all, minutes in relation to our meeting on April 30th, 2025 for deferral. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that the aforementioned minutes be deferred at this time.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, April 30th, 2025 be deferred. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The thinks the ayes have it. Minutes are accordingly deferred. Notice of absence has been received from Senator Malalu. Indications of lateness have been received from and indications of lateness have been received from Senator Maynard, Senator Boyce, and Senator Kevin Boyce, that is, and Senator Dr. Crystal Drakes. A bit further announcements, take this opportunity to record a thanks to former Senator Chad Blackman, who served us for a short time, but certainly made certainly made a significant contribution and a big impression on the chamber during his presence. I want to congratulate him. He is, by way of the democratic process, transferred to the other place. I certainly wish him a wonderful and successful tenure in the House of Assembly of Barbados. So I want to thank him for his service and congratulate Senator Blackman.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummings.
Mr.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents. One, the Barbados Deposit Insurance Corporation, BDIC, annual reports for the years 2022, 2023, and 2024. The 2024 annual report and audited financial statements of the Central Bank of Barbados. The Barbados Economic and Social Report of 2024, the Public Officers Loan and Travelling Allowances Amendment Regulations of 2025, the report of the Parliamentary Reform Commission of 2024, and finally, Mr. President, the Tourism Linkages Policy.
Report from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to business or sitting of the Senate and moved by minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension for Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is, the Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Standing Order 45-2 is therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Adoption of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. Mr. President, I beg to give notice first of the following bills: the Road Traffic Amendment Number 2 Bill 2025 and the Supreme Court of Judicature Amendment and Validation Bill of 2025 also. I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. The first reading, Mr. President, of the Student Revolving Loan Fund Bill of 2025, the first reading of the Insurance Amendment Bill of 2025, the first reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Number 2 Bill of 2025, and finally, the Supreme Court of Judicature Amendment and Validation Bill also of 2025.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 7, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Stormwater Management Bill 2025.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, thank you very much for recognizing me. Before I get into my actual presentation today, I want to take a moment to join you in acknowledging the contribution and the ascension to the lower house. It's almost an oxymoron to put it in this way. The ascension to the lower house of our former Senate colleague and now the Honourable Chad Blackman MP, who has transitioned to another place. Not only has he transitioned, but he has transitioned in resounding style, having commanded some 87.3% or so of the vote in his election to the constituency of St. James North. And I want to join my colleagues in celebrating his appointment as a new member of Parliament in the other place for St. James North. His contribution initially in this honourable chamber on matters relating to economic affairs and investment in the first instance, and then secondly on the education sector were valuable, and we very much appreciate the time that he shared here with us, and we appreciate the time that he continues to share with us in Cabinet, continuing to guide and contribute to the management of our country's interests. I want also to take a moment to acknowledge the absence today of one of our senators, Senator Andrew Malalu, who is one of our independent senators. I know if he could be here today, he was, but I think all of us are used to the notices from the Honorable President of his absences due to his commitment to the World Racing Federation, Motor Racing Federation, and he is a committed rallyist, if that is the word, but certainly a committed car racer. And over the course of the last few days, over the weekend, during rally, he was involved in a significant accident, and he has sustained injuries as a consequence of that accident while rallying. And we want to, on behalf of the government of Barbados, extend our continued support. I would say that I have spoken with him a couple of times since the accident, just to inquire as to how he's doing. He is in good spirits despite having sustained significant injuries. And so I am happy that today he has been, last night, overnight, he was discharged from surgical ICU in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and he is now recovering at home, but he is certainly going to remain in all of our prayers for his swift recovery. Today, Mr. President, is the 4th of June. 4th of June is not a day that we take lightly, neither is the 1st of June, Mr. President, because it is a day when, on an annual basis, we commence hurricane season. It is a day, Mr. President, when all of Barbados knows that the official start of the hurricane season has commenced, even though we know that earlier and earlier in the year, we begin to experience weather as the effects of climate start to kick in or continue to kick in. Until the year concludes a little later on, down somewhere around September, October, we start to breathe a little bit more easily, Mr. President, as hurricane season hopefully has passed us. But there are occasions in the past, Mr. President, where hurricane season has not passed through our region without scathing us. In 2019, in Bahamas, Hurricane Dorian dodged us and found its way into the Northern Caribbean, where it sat on Grand Bahama Island and Abaco Island for 48 hours, 2 days straight. It resulted, Mr. President, in over $3.4 billion in damage to those 2 islands of the Bahamas. If we go a little further back, Mr. President, in Dominica, just a hop and a skip and a jump away, in 2017, Hurricane Maria sat on Dominica. 95, not 59, not 5 and not 9, but 95% of the housing stock of Dominica was destroyed in Hurricane Maria. 226% of Dominica's GDP was destroyed in a storm that lasted just a few hours. The damage to Bahamas, the damage to Dominica, the damage to Barbuda, the damage to Curacao, the damage to countries all across the Caribbean as a result of hurricane season is well documented. In the space, Mr. President, of just a few hours, or in the case of Bahamas, just 2 days, could you imagine living under the ravages of wind, storm surge, waves, rain, intense rain, Mr. President, for 48 hours? Mr. President, Beryl passed through this country last year. It actually didn't even pass through this country. It passed off the coast of this country, on its way to wreaking havoc in Canouan and off of other islands in the region. But having passed off of Barbados, it created such intense storm surge that Barbados's coastal areas from the Bridgetown area all the way down to the west coast got battered. Storm surge, Mr. President. Storm surge in Bahamas, storm surge in Dominica, landslides, rain, slippage, storm surge in Canouan, wind, intense rain, landslides. These are the issues, Mr. President, that countries of the Caribbean grapple with when June rolls around, when hurricane season begins, Mr. President. We don't even necessarily have to have, in some countries in the region and even here in Barbados, a storm hit us directly. Elsa was a Category 1 storm. She didn't even hit us directly, but we had issues of flooding, coastal damage, and Beryl showed us what coastal damage could happen even if, again, you don't get a direct hit. And so, Mr. President, I want to contextualize today's bill before this honorable chamber within the context of that broader hurricane preparedness. What happens in small countries like ours when we face intense weather systems, rain, wind, waves, surge, and what the impact on our infrastructure and our people has been over the years based on the experiences of other jurisdictions and our own experiences, Mr. President. So the bill before us is a bill that attempts to repeal previous legislation that was in place. Dated legislation. The legislation that this is repealing, Mr. President, is the original Prevention of Floods Act of 1951. And like much legislation across this country, we've tinkered with and amended legislation as circumstances have presented themselves because we've needed to make certain amendments. And this amendment, Mr. President, was amended on 5 different occasions. The last time that this Prevention of the Floods Act was amended was in 1998, Mr. President, 1998. 1998, Mr. President, and we know that 1998, the changes made in 1998, Mr. President, came after the last major changes made to this legislation in 1996. And in 1996, why were major changes made to the original Prevention of Floods Act? Mr. President, I was a university student at the time, a student of the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Barbados at home on holiday. I had my first summer job. I was in the St. James area, Mr. President, and the rain started to fall. And the rains continued to fall. It was not in the midst of a hurricane. It was not in the midst of a storm. It was intense rain over an extended period of time. And we all know in 1996 what happened when those rains fell in the St. James area and what happened to the Calypsonian who lost his life during that period in 1996. That was the legislation, Mr. President, that was the last major change to the legislation to address blockages of water courses by private contractors, private developers, and private builders, Mr. President, that then result in water courses being changed, the direction of water flow being altered, and then you could potentially have catastrophic effects on both life and property. And so it was felt by this administration that the time had come for us to move beyond 1951 legislation on a matter, especially since, for consistency, this is a country where the government and our Prime Minister in particular has been leading on the impact of climate. More intense weather systems, more frequent weather systems, even outside of hurricanes and storms hitting us directly, what is the impact on our infrastructure of water? And so this government undertook then to repeal and to have a comprehensive replacement to the Prevention of Floods Act of 1951. And the bill that is before this honorable chamber is that comprehensive replacement, Mr. President. The bill is called the Stormwater Management Bill, and it goes well beyond the actual original origins of the Prevention of Floods Act, and I want to take a moment to make sure that I go through the bill for the benefit of those in the chamber and those listening as well. It is not a long bill, and so it's not going to take me terribly long to go through it, but I want to go into some of the sections. In the current bill, it has 7 parts. The current bill speaks about a range of things like flood zones and flood works, what is required and under flood zones and flood works, Mr. President. It speaks about what is required to declare a flood zone, planning of flood works, the ability to execute planned flood works, what happens when the authorities need to enter premises regarding planned flood works, the power to execute flood works under emergency circumstances, and then, of course, one of the most important things that certainly the Ministry of Transport and Works has been addressing is maintenance of the drainage infrastructure to ensure that we are able both on public lands and private lands where there's an obligation on the part of homeowners, landowners, and developers to treat the drainage infrastructure. Building in flood zones without permission is then prohibited under this first section of the legislation, which is Part 2. Under Part 3, it assigns rights and responsibilities. And so, you know, Prime Minister Motley has been sharing on more than one occasion, and it is something that I 100% support, the balancing of rights with responsibilities. You have a right to do certain things, but you have a responsibility that goes along with how you execute those rights. And so when you are an owner or an occupier of land, what are your responsibilities? And Part 3 of this legislation in this draft bill speaks to that. Duties of owners and occupiers. It puts restrictions on things like the planting of trees, crops, and so on in flood zones. It speaks about the importance of installation of storm water disposal systems. It speaks also, Mr. President, about the importance of keeping access to outfalls and drainage reserves clear. This is critical, Mr. President, keeping access to outfalls and drainage reserves clear, not building in a way that obstructs the outfalls, not looking after your own interests at the expense of others in your surrounding communities, and in some instances, if you are on high ground, those lower ground, on lower ground before you. It requires also the responsibilities of owners and to take responsibility for the inspection of cleaning of stormwater drainage wells and other infrastructure. There has been an extensive conversation in this country, Mr. President, about, especially on plantation lands and large tracts of land. One, people taking responsibility for cleaning their lands of brush, yes, on the one hand, but there are a number of wells all across this country that are on private land as well, that are not cleaned, they're not maintained, they're not covered, and they have a negative impact on our drainage infrastructure. It then goes on and it talks about who has responsibility to pay for these flood works that would then be rendered necessary if the state has to undertake it. And similarly, Mr. President, we were here the last time and we had a discussion around the health services bill that we were making changes to. And in that piece of legislation, it was about homeowners, landowners, developers taking responsibility for lands which they owned, keeping them clear if those lands then were allowed to run amok and the bush got out of control, it became a nuisance to people around you, and circumstances presented themselves where all other efforts had been frustrated, and the state had to intervene and to clean those lands. The state would do so, but it then becomes billed back to you. And equally so, in this instance, this legislation treats it in the same way for flood works rendered necessary by the actions of owners and occupiers. Now, on land developers, this is an issue as well. We have communities across Barbados where you have residents of the communities reaching out to members of the state, members of the Housing Department, Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Transport and Works, because they're having drainage issues. But it was a private developer in a private development that was developed without provision for adequate drainage, and so the need for oversight, approval, and parameters that govern how developers build developments across this country is captured in this legislation in Part 4. And so it has here under Part 4, the section is duties of land developers, and it separates the role of land developers from landowners or occupiers. There are two different categories and they're treated differently in the legislation. And it requires the submission of storm water drainage plans. What are you doing? In the same way that for the purpose of your other utilities, you have to have a plan and it is approved by the various institutions. In the same way now, by this legislation, you are developing a community, doing a housing development or some kind of development, you are required to have a storm water drainage plan. And then there's a requirement for the construction of drainage systems. What is fit for purpose for a 2-bedroom house may not be fit for purpose for a 2-story, 5-bedroom house. It may not be fit for story for a hotel. It may not be fit for story for a 20-house development. It may not be fit for purpose for a villa or a condominium development project. Each project is going to require a specific bespoke drainage system, and that has to be submitted as part of your stormwater drainage plan. Then there are some provisions that prohibit what you cannot do, as captured in Section 5, disposal of garbage, and I want to spend a moment talking about garbage. I want to take a moment in this hurricane season to appeal to Barbadians, to appeal to right-thinking, responsible Barbadians, because I know that fundamentally, that's who we are. That's who we are, Mr. President. There are those who will do the wrong thing, but I cannot tell you how tired I am driving behind cars, driving behind ZRs, driving behind buses, driving behind trucks. If you eat KFC, if you eat Chafette, and you finish and you in the vehicle, you gotta get out, no? You gotta get out at some point, you're going home or you're going to someplace else where I can guarantee you that there's a garbage bin. I can promise you can find a garbage bin. There is no reason for Barbadians to continue this disgusting practice of throwing garbage through car windows and vehicle windows onto the road. It is disgusting. There's no reason for Barbadians to find every beautiful scenic route in this country where it is lush and green and overgrown with shrubbery and find a way to dump old fridges, old mattresses, old stoves. It is ridiculous and it is disgusting. It is time for Barbadians to stop it. If they call for a special collection from the Sanitation Service Authority, they will come and it doesn't cost them anything. They will come to you. They will pick it up from you. Call the Sanitation Service Authority. We are doing foolishness because come a little later, when the rain starts to fall and we have water collecting in certain parts of this country and the officials from drainage go in, what do they find? Plastic bottles, boxes, plastic bags, all kinds of garbage that has no business in our drainage system. And they did not walk there. The stores that they were bought from did not put them there. They did not dump them there. They found their way there because people who have the ability to dispose of garbage properly threw away their garbage indiscriminately and put the drainage system under unnecessary and uncalled for pressure. Stop it. Stop it. It is time to cut it out. We know what them words mean and where they came from. It's time to do it. If there was no Sanitation Service Authority, I wouldn't even mind. If there was a cost for the Sanitation Service Authority coming and doing a special collection from you with your old bed, your old fridge, or whatever it is, I wouldn't even mind. But it doesn't cost you anything. You don't live in the ZR, you're getting out. And there are garbage bins all over this country, black base with a green bin that the government gave everybody, that you didn't have to pay for or either. Use them. And it speaks to a mindset, because come flooding in any of these areas where garbage continues to be disposed of inappropriately, the first thing they will send the body and come and clean the drains. They may have needed to come and clean the drains, that is true, but we need to also stop clogging the drains with garbage that is improperly disposed of. We need to stop it. Rights come with responsibilities, and the responsibility of us as Barbadians is to keep this country clean. It is not clean just because it looks good. It does. It is a beautiful country. We live where people vacation. That's what we say, right? That's what we say. So respect it accordingly. And equally so, in the context of today's debate, this is a stormwater bill. And it speaks about our drainage infrastructure and the importance of keeping our drainage infrastructure free in Part 5, General Prohibitions, how to dispose of public stormwater infrastructure, the disposal of garbage and debris, the erection of fences, walls, and so on, and other obstructions of the drainage infrastructure. There are things that you can't avoid. Sometimes a tree may fall down, it may block something, it may break something. That is something that is a natural act. But when it is within our control, I'm begging you now, Barbadians have to stop it. We have to do better. So the flood legislation, the stormwater legislation before us is speaking about the importance of us maintaining the infrastructure. Now, one of the things that legislation in this country often does is to treat to enforcement in a certain way. This legislation at Part 6 speaks about enforcement. This is always one of the most important things because aside from what your rights are, it outlines what is required, storm management plans and all of those things. Those things are all good. It speaks about the responsibilities of owners and occupiers. It speaks about the responsibilities that are assigned to land developers. It talks also about the things that you're not meant to do. But if you still insist on doing the wrong thing, under the wrong circumstances, it has enforcement provisions. And the enforcement provisions are captured in Part 6, Sections 23 to 28, where it talks about the power of entry and inspection, the power to remove an obstruction in an emergency, liability discharging in the contravention of the Act, the payment of a fixed penalty, because fixed penalties are captured in legislation, certificate to be sufficient evidence, and then the obstruction of authorized persons. If an authorized person needs to enter a facility or a building or an area to be able to respond under certain conditions, what are the penalties in the event that you obstruct that ability? And then finally, the section here on Part 8 is the miscellaneous section. It covers the additional catch-all things in the paper of the bill, the power of the state to take lands under the land acquisition provisions, what the compensation would be when the state has to take those lands, matters regarding to computing compensation. We know that there's always this conversation around land tax valuation, whereas the market valuation may be something else. That is captured in the legislation. And if all else fails and you're unable to find your way forward and reach agreement on compensation, then it establishes arbitration provisions, and the role of the chief technical officer is captured there. The administrative provisions of the bill are then captured at Part 8, Section 35 for repeal and for commencement at 36, and then the schedule covers the fixed penalty notice. These are the provisions of the legislation, Mr. President, that you have before you. Now, I want to go through a couple of very specific provisions of the legislation in the interest of getting into the weeds of the text for the benefit of those in the chamber and then the public. The original Section 8, which we just spoke about, which would have been the permission to enter premises, and I spoke about that earlier, there are no significant changes that are made to this over and above the Prevention of Floods Act in the first instance, but it does talk about a notice period required for the preparatory work by the Chief Technical Officer and what needs to be done. In emergency sections, in emergency conditions, 5, Section 9, formerly, which would have been originally Section 5A, there are not a number of significant provisions that have changed in there as well. And then it talks about infrastructure, and I want to spend a moment on infrastructure as well as on Section 11, building in a flood zone without permission. This particular provision of the legislation speaks about persons who are building structures in the flood zone without having permission from the respective planning and development department. And they have the ability to grant permission, but they have the ability to be able to also respond to instances where building has taken place without confirming, without approval, and then to ensure compliance. Any person who contravenes this provision is found to be guilty of an offense and liable to conviction on summary conviction of a fine of $20,000. This is meant to be a disincentive to persons building in a flood zone without permission. It also speaks, I'm talking about the responsibilities and the enforcement provisions where you are planting in flood zones without permission. The same thing applies here. A person who contravenes this provision is guilty of an offense and subject to a fine. That fine is also $20,000. The same thing applies where landowners who are using their property for residential purposes residential purposes is excluding a house, a dwelling, commercial or industrial purposes must take measures to install and maintain the effective stormwater disposal system that I spoke about in section 13. Any person who does not do this is liable to a conviction of $20,000. Now, this particular section is targeted at developments. I spoke about this earlier. We have a number of developments across this country where people put developments, they come and they build houses, they put in the roads, they put in the utilities, but the drainage infrastructure is inadequate. And before you turn around 2 times, rain falls and the homeowners are finding that their living rooms are underwater and they're having difficulties. So this section includes now, for the first time, a responsibility on owners to install stormwater systems for properties used as apartments, condominiums, commercial buildings or industrial buildings, and it targets the developers whose developments create high plot coverage of hard standing areas like roofs, car parks, road lawns, and so on. And without proper drainage systems, these are the kinds of properties that will result in a higher percentage of runoff generated as a result of rain and flooding, and that would then have an impact on highways. But it is also meant to reduce the reliance on government highways, because what ends up happening is that these developments don't have the stormwater systems in place. They're channeling the water out to the main roads, the public roads, where the government highways are, and then the highways are flooded, but the water has originated from the actions or the inactions, in this case, of a developer. Equally so, it ensures that the drainage reserves are to be kept clear of obstructions. So where you have blocked outfalls and drainage reserves, the ministry wants to ensure that these areas are kept clear for the purpose of drainage provision. And what are they blocked by? I spoke earlier about the beds, the fridges, the stoves, the mattresses, all kinds of foolishness. We even have seen, in some instances, areas that are blocked by things like old vehicles that have just been discarded and left. Stored materials that are just accumulated, construction waste, that is a major culprit, bulky waste, plants and then structures that have been illegally constructed. So these are some of the things that the legislation that is before us is intent on addressing for the benefit of Barbadians. And when I say Barbadians, I mean that for both the benefit of developers who want to reduce their own liability when people buy their houses, for Barbadians who have bought the houses, and for people who are not in these communities or who are in these communities and want to avoid being affected by drainage issues in hurricane season and out of hurricane season. If low rain falls, they want to be able to ensure that this work is done. Now, I want to switch and pivot a little bit in my final section of my presentation to speak about the work that has already been undertaken by the Ministry of Transport and Works. I preface those comments, Mr. President, by making the point that all of us in here run households. All of us. All of us in here know what it is. Well, not all of us. Some of us may have more than others. But for those of us who don't have all that we would want, I want to make this point. We know we have a household budget. We know that on any given month, we may have $100 to spend. We know that we have rent or mortgage, car payment, food, children to send to school, and $100 may be there. We know that by the time we've spent that $100, we have loans to service, because if we have a house, we got to pay back for the house. If we have a car, we got to pay back for the car. If we got children maybe overseas at university, we got student loans to service. So we can't do everything we want to do all at once. We have to be able to budget. That's how we run our houses. That's how we run our businesses. So the government is no different. The government has spent and has invested in roads and in drainage infrastructure over the last 8 years in addressing the fundamental issues that this bill is attempting to cover. From roads and new drainage infrastructure being put in, that has been a considerable investment by the Ministry of Transport and Works over the last 8 years. We didn't have a lot of work done on all of these areas before, but we've had to do it all and start to do the work. Has it all been done? No. Are there still areas that need to be done? Yes. But just like our households and just like our businesses, we have to be able to do it bit by bit by bit, when the funds are available to be able to make sure that all across the country, from St. Lucie to St. Philip, from Christchurch to St. Michael, St. Thomas, and St. George, included in the middle of the country, we have to make sure that the work gets done. And so this government has made the largest investment in infrastructure that we could have made in the last 8 years. And let it be clear before I take my seat. The previous government did none of this work. I know we are going to expect that they're going to have landed from Mars somewhere and disassociated themselves from their past and their record, and they're going to say, well, what the government should and should not do, but they're not going to know it for themselves when they did not do the work and we are coming from behind. They will know which schools were not fixed, Mr. President, but they will not talk about those schools. They will say what the government needs to do. I'm getting in front of it. They will know, Mr. President, what road works need to be done, but they will not tell you that they didn't fix them for 10 years. They will tell you which roads are flooding and which areas have flooding, but they will not tell you what they did not do in those same areas for 10 years. They will not tell you that. They behave as though they have a sense of cognitive dissonance. This wasn't me. It was somebody else also by the name of the DLP. It wasn't me. So I am here to say to this honorable chamber that this government, with the resources that it has had, with Elsa and Beryl having affected us during this period, with 2 years of no income, 1 full year for sure of no income, that this government has still found its way to make the largest investment in roads from north to south, from east to west. Whether you want to accept it or not, the evidence is there for all to see. You could try to deny it like the emperor and his new clothes, but the roads are there. The drainage has been made investments in, and we can see that as well. And we've also acknowledged upfront that more has to be done. Without a doubt, there are communities across this country that need to have the drainage issues addressed, that this stormwater bill is meant to benefit. There are communities across this country that want to be able to see developers taking greater responsibility and oversight for building of properties. Mr. President, if you go to the Hilton, I know all of us at some point in time have been to the Hilton to a conference and a meeting. We've seen that even at the Hilton, the undercroft under the Hilton is meant to be able to address storm flow. In the event that there is a storm surge, the water is meant to pass underneath that undercroft that's breezy and windy, but it's really a storm measure. Really, it is a storm surge method. That's what it's there for. And so when we talk about storm drainage plans and storm water plans and surge plans, these are the kinds of building mechanisms that are meant to be put in place to allow for storm surge to be managed in areas which are highly vulnerable. Finally, I want to say, Mr. President, that this government, under what used to be the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy, had done a considerable body of work. That body of work looks at the country as a whole, and it can tell you now what are flood-prone areas, what the low-lying areas are, and I know that there are those in here that have spoken about some specific low-lying areas where construction has taken place and what the vulnerabilities are, and I'm sure we'll hear about those in time to come during the course of today. But we've also had the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy speaking about that work, which has identified all along the South Coast in particular, those areas that are considered to be vulnerable and need to be, in some instances, evacuated and cleared under conditions where there is meant to be significant rainfall or storm surge. So we planned, we've mapped, we've invested, and now, Mr. President, we're here today to add to the arsenal of storm management systems and protection of people and infrastructure legislation. Planned, mapped, implemented, invested, and now legislating, Mr. President. And so these things all taken together not as single standalone measures, but all taken together as a suite of interventions, is what this government is investing in, and it is what this bill represents a culmination of in legislation. It is not the end. It is a continuous process that must be ongoing, and the Ministry of Transport and Works and the other ministries that are relevant to this process will continue to undertake that work, Mr. President, and I'm confident that as this bill has the benefit of the robust discussion that I know this chamber is always capable of, and I'm looking forward to being in a position in my wrapping up to respond to any of the queries that are raised by the colleagues, and I want to beg that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as I rise to contribute to this debate, I also would like to join with the Leader of Government Business and you, Mr. President, in congratulating our former colleague from this chamber, Senator Chad Blackman, in his elevation to be the MP for St. James North. And also at the same time, in wishing Senator Malalu well in his recovery, and I am hoping that he would have a speedy recovery. Mr. President, this piece of legislation, it does not really offer much in terms of a fight in this debate, but it gives an opportunity for us to deal with an issue which is of grave concern to many Barbadians. Because we may not have had the direct impact of the storms in terms of the wind, but we definitely have felt the rain and the impact of the rain and also the extent to the flooding. So there's really no need to pick a noise in this situation, but we can definitely elaborate on these issues and look to see how best we can make the country resilient in terms of stormwater management. Over the years, as the Leader of Government Business has said, we have recognized it's not just during the hurricane season, but if you would recall, in January of this year, we also had some very unexpected rains as well. And I think even after, towards the end of the hurricane season this year, maybe in November leading into December, you had some very heavy thunderstorm showers, especially in the afternoon due to well, don't let me be a meteorologist. Convection. Don't let me be the meteorologist today. But it shows that the pattern has changed and we are getting a lot of unseasonal rain, or we're even getting rain in what we consider to be the dry season. And in some instances, the volume of water that comes with this rain is often more than you would expect, and it would be to the level that it can cause significant damage. So this piece of legislation is important, and to the Democratic Labour Party, we also always recognize that drainage was important, because when we came to office in 2008, one of the problems that we faced in this country was anytime the rain fell, you had significant flooding, especially in the areas of Baxter's Road. All across Barbados, you had significant flooding. And one of the first interventions made by a Democratic Labour Party government in 2008 was the need to have a drainage unit in place that would go about taking on the responsibility of cleaning the wells and cleaning and clearing the wells and making sure that we had adequate drainage in the country. And that, for some period of time, helped to alleviate some of the flooding which was experienced in this country. I do know that all governments see it as important in terms of dealing with drainage, because, you know, you could be fine in 1 minute and then you go on in terms of having a heavy downpour of rain to find that communities are wiped out. because of the poor drainage in some areas. So in looking at this piece of legislation, I want to look at the way how we build our roads and how we, in terms of make sure that we have adequate drainage on our roadways. Now, in the past, the roads and the highways were built with a gradient so that the water would not settle on the road, but would actually move to the drains at the sides of the road. So it almost as though the road was built with a hump in the center of the road and a curvature that took the water down to the drains on either side of the roads. I recognize that nowadays with our current mill and pave program, that we are not necessarily seeing that gradient in the roads, and we have a number of roads which are flat and results in the water settling on the roads, and it causes another problem because whenever it rains in Barbados, you can look forward to a pothole appearing on the road after the water has dried up, because our roads are no longer being built with an adequate gradient that would cause the water to move to the sides of the roads. It is settling on the top of the road, and as a result of that, it is eating away at the road surface and causing a number of potholes to develop. These are things that if we are doing a flood stormwater and planning and dealing with flooding, we actually have to put these things in place. Not only the gradient, but also making sure that we have adequate wells along the roadways that will channel the water off of the roads into these wells. These are things that would help to prevent flooding. And there are a number of ways in which this can be done. In agricultural areas, and I think there's one in Lears, but before that, I'm from St. John, there's one in Redland, which captured a lot of the water that came off of the road and going into a dam, and that water was later used for agricultural purposes, so that during the dry season, you can use it to pump off for irrigation for crops. You have that same feature in the Lears area. I believe that we probably need to do more of that, especially in agricultural areas, and channel the rainwater runoff into dams that can be utilized for agricultural irrigation, or channel the water, building more suck wells, or you may not even need to build more suck wells, but actually clean the path that leads to the wells, there are numerous wells all across Barbados in the cane fields, which were utilized by plantations years ago for irrigation. And if we can get a program that, I know that there's a well cleaning program which is done by the government, if we can get that program up and running and effectively operating, and also get the landowners, the plantation owners, to participate in this program, because it's not just a matter of cleaning the well, but you also need to have the channel or the surface so that the water would easily run off of the road into these wells, or run out of the fields into these wells. And that would help to avoid a number of instances of flooding. Now, there's another aspect of it too, coming from the country days. In St. John, whenever we have heavy rain, we get the water is either turned off or it comes out muddy. And I guess that this happens in a number of different areas. Now, I do know that a lot of it has to do with the way how the fields are plowed and the direction in which the water runs in the fields. And that cuscus grass that you will see around the fields as well help to trap some of that mud from going into the roadway, and then resulting in that mud going into the water system. You have a serious problem with that at Colleton Plantation in St. John. over the last couple of months, whenever you have heavy rain, that road is actually impassable because of the heavy buildup of mud in the road coming directly from the field. So you need to contour the roads in the field in such a way that it would not allow the water to run directly into the road and the mud to leave the fields and go into the road, because the mud serves a better benefit in the fields. So all of these things are things that you need to consider when you're dealing with flood mitigation, building the wells, the correct channels in the field so that the water will run in the correct direction, and also making the channels in the field so that the water would have a clear path in the fields into these suck wells or dams, whatever the situation would be. So I also want to, going back to road construction, I think this is going to be important because sometimes you may fix a road in one area because the residents or the constituents, they wanted the road done for the longest while, but the way how it is done, it might affect another community, which is exactly what this legislation is all about. And sometimes the MTW is a chief culprit for this as well. So it is not just the private contractors which would become a nuisance or run afoul of this legislation, but also the MTW themselves. And I can give an example of Jolts Road in the constituency of St. Michael's Central. That road was recently done. That road was recently done because of the residents wanted a freshly paved road. But as a result of that...
On a point of order, Mr.
Now, what's the point of order?
The Honorable Senator may have in his exuberance made a slight error in language. He said that the legislation, he said when things happen, you fix one problem in one place, something may happen somewhere else, and that the legislation is geared towards that. And I think, no, you said that the legislation is geared towards that.
Fixing that.
That's not what you said. So I just wanted to be very clear on that, because you said when you set out to fix one problem, you can sometimes go and solve another, create another one. And this is what the legislation is about. That is exactly what you said. And I just wanted to make a point of order for him to correct himself on that.
Thank you. I'm sure he will correct himself accordingly.
Thank you,
Yes,
Mr. President. I think the senator should have risen on a point of order when the leader of government business was doing her intervention. She spoke about Weston. I am certain that the leader... You said St. James, in the area of St. James, where the famous Calypsonian lost his life. Okay. Anyhow, but Mr. President, the purpose of this legislation, which it has mentioned, is that in situations where you have a property, which you built a property and then that property causes flooding in another area, this is what the legislation is intended to fix. And also intended to fix flood zones so that you would not, persons would not in flood zones build dams or walls or anything that would help to make the flooding in the area any worse. And that is the point Richard was making. So if the senator, who I don't know, he wants to get into the cut and trust, but you need to fire your pistol at the right time. The point I was making, Mr. President, with regards to Jolts Road, that road was done, but at the end of the road, the section towards Sealy Land, it could benefit from having a higher wall so that because the road has a natural gradient towards Sealy Land, so that when the water runs down off of the road towards Sealy Land, it would have the higher wall to prevent the water from running off the road directly into the the property of the residents in Sealy Land. And it could also benefit from having suck wells built on either side or on one side, channeling the water off of Jokes Road into those suck wells so that you will not then create a problem for the residents in Sealy Land, which is just on the other side or towards the end. And that is exactly what is happening right now with that particular road and to residents in the area of Sealy Land. And that's the point that I want to make, that the MTW, Mr. President, would also run afoul of this particular legislation, and more oversight needs to be given in the way how work is done to alleviate problems, because you may alleviate a problem in one district, but ended up causing a problem in another area, because you do not put in place all of the necessary works to make sure that you alleviate that problem. So what this legislation would do would bring about more thorough oversight, and I hope that the provisions are in place, because you can't just have the legislation, but you don't have the persons with the technical knowledge to execute and to carry out the work to make sure that the legislation is effective. So that is important as well, that you have the persons with the necessary skill sets within the ministry to make sure that they can follow through and execute with this piece of legislation. The leader of government business also mentioned the way how the Hilton Hotel is constructed. And I wanted to mention that because I know that we are going into the construction of a number of hotels along the coastal area, especially in the controversial Old Town Civic Center, which is prone to flooding. And for that reason, you need to take into consideration when you are building these properties that you have adequate height in terms of dealing with the anticipated storm surge and the level, and also a clear path that if you get an excessive storm surge, that the water would have a clear flow and not destroy the property. So it does not make sense building a property that would run counter to the flow of the water, the natural flow of the water. So, and not necessarily within this legislation, but we still have to contemplate things like tsunamis as well, which could come into play with this legislation as well. Guess not for that. So, Mr. President, as I said at the outset, there is not much in this legislation that you would want to argue with. There's really no reason to pick a noise. There's really no reason to rise on a point of order. And I thank you for the opportunity to make my intervention.
Thank you very much, Senator Worrell. Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I shan't be long on this. I shan't be long on this, but I do think it is important that we look at the seriousness within which this particular legislation has been framed and why it is so. We know as small island developing states, especially islands in particular, where we are surrounded by water, that the risk and the vulnerability that we have is unparalleled. And these measures are, I don't want to use the words long overdue, because I think we have to do things incrementally because of our size and our economies and what we can and cannot do. But I think it is very timely, as we all know, and as was mentioned by the previous senator, the ravages of climate change are extremely real. And we, Barbados, at this 166 square miles in the Atlantic Ocean by itself, become even more vulnerable, I dare say, than some of the other islands who might, in some instances, have a different topography that gives them a little bit more latitude. If you look places like Oistins, if it's whole South Coast, you have fishing going on there. You have all these different things that happen in these areas around the country. It is really important that we get some aspects of this legislation in, especially when we talk about infrastructure and building, to have that put in place to deal with these potentially devastating events that, again, increase with the climate change. But a couple of things were said earlier that we really do need to bring some light on. One, it was mentioned about the loss of cuscus grass across the country. And if memory serves me well, I believe it would have been in 2019 that a program was started under the Ministry of Agriculture to replant cuscus grass across the island. There was also a mention of the building of more, and I'll use the word dams, to collect water. Under the Ministry of Agriculture, that also was done, and I believe it continues. I remember there was one done at River in St. Philip. There's one, I believe, in Sturgis, in St. Thomas. So a number of those things have already been put in place and continue to be done to help, again, with the mitigation for flooding. But I believe that we need to do a lot more in terms of, as was mentioned earlier, appealing to the people of this country to take this risk of flooding seriously. I had the pleasure and honor, Mr. President, of representing St. Philip West. And in that constituency, I also had the headache of trying to understand how permissions were granted for persons to build homes in the Woodburn area. This area, sir, is, I believe, the lowest point of this country. And I witnessed where persons building in that area then went on to dig and build further down, trying to get apartments and different things like that to extend their homes and also to bring in some more economic activity. But I also had, in one incident, to drive into the area to see the bottom of a whole house flooded. And if there were any little children or anything, or anybody who was probably, Airbnb wasn't as prevalent as it is today, but if there was any person living in that area, they would have died. I saw where walls that are supposed to be guard walls around homes destroyed by the water. And to be quite honest, in that particular area, we have struggled for many, many years to find adequate solutions to dealing with the problem of flooding there. I also was representative for Lowlands in Christchurch. The same problem. As a minister, I had to take time out with people when the rains fell to go into the area myself and lift garbage out of the drainage. Myself and two other people, and clean them in order to stop what could have been potential deaths. So this legislation and this issue is nothing for us to toy with or to make sly remarks about, because we are talking about loss of life, we're talking about loss of property, and God forbid that something happens and you have to rebuild, you now got to look for money to rebuild things like hospitals or schools or whatever that may very well be damaged if we don't, one, begin to put these measures in place. That means that you have to build to a certain standard. Two, as this legislation requires now, where people have to build with drainage in mind and these kind of things. And I'll just give you a very short example of what I saw, not in Barbados, but in Dubai. I had the opportunity to go to Dubai in 2019 also, representing government. And whilst there, rain fell. Rain like what we would call a passing shower. And the whole place shut down. School shut down, everything shut down. And we said, we from Barbados, we said, but there's a little bit of water. But it then struck me that because these folks live in a desert region, they have no concept of water management or drainage. And so for us, living this part of the world, who have to face it from the day we born to the day we die, should take this seriously. Should take it very seriously. And as my father would always say, leave the mock sport at the door. Because as I said from the beginning, this is not just a matter of, as was mentioned, a cut and thrust politics. We are dealing with people's lives and livelihoods. So I support this legislation, sir, and I really do look forward for other measures and policies that I'm sure that will come, because in doing some research, I realized that in other parts of the world, people are looking for what they term as ecosystem solutions, where they're doing things, yes, where they're doing things using the natural habitat and different things to ensure that they mitigate against flooding. And so we have mangroves, and we have all of the other things that they say you can do, and I'm hoping that we would find the opportunity to use those methods also. And sir, with those very few words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Kaine. Any speakers? Senator Maynard.
It appears as though the government doesn't want people to take the time to speak today. Mr. President, I rise as an independent senator because I'm not aligned in either direction. But I rise to lavish the government with some praise. Mr. President, since I've been in this chamber, we've had, I think, two major pieces of water-related legislation. One was the amended Water Authority Act, and now there's this bill. But we live, sir, in a time when water has become much more of a global issue than some of us think. I watched in the wee hours of the morning, I think it was 2 days ago, comments, she probably needs to see a doctor, comments regarding a report laid in Parliament in the United Kingdom related to Thames water. I do not believe that Barbados is very far behind in some ways. What struck me was the fact that there were comments about the level of environmental contamination that has resulted from pouring raw sewage into the water system. I believe, sir, that quietly we continue to do the same, but I've not heard from anyone any clearly stated plan with a time frame for cessation of that activity. It may appear to be a safe practice, but I'm sure it causes its own set of problems. Mr. President, the Right Honorable Seymour Arthur once asked the Chief Town Planner, Mr. Mark Cummins, what, in his opinion, was the greatest hindrance to development. And Mr. Cummins, to Mr. Arthur's shock, said water. He believed, sir, that Mr. Cummins was speaking about potable water, but he was not. He was speaking about all water, in all its forms, whether it's potable, whether it's from sewage, whether it is storm water. He was speaking of water generally. And I, sir, believe that he is right. This government and this country, and whichever government is in power, has to look at a total water plan for the country. Because the water today that is potable water is sewage tomorrow, and if we get it right, it might be potable water again. And potable water as proper potable water. So this country, sir, has to take water very, very seriously. Mr. Cummins' answer was a very loaded answer, and it makes it incumbent upon the government, while you cannot do everything at one time, because you probably not get it all done well, to pick out areas that you can fix and fix them and do it well. There is no question, sir, that we have lots of storm water problems. A previous, sir, speaker spoke of flood water. I think he did. But, sir, the definition of flood water in this bill, under interpretation, also refers to storm surge from the sea. And we've not given much consideration for storm surge. But the fact that all of our beaches disappeared, if not all, most of our beaches disappeared during Beryl, speaks to that. And it is only a matter of time, sir, before the salt water actually gets inland if we don't do the right things. I refer to inland as surface water. There are some among us who believe that it's already inland based on what is happening in St. Lucie with the salt water ingress in the wells. But it's important for the government to look at a comprehensive plan that, along with its resilience strategy, that is clear for all to see, where all the essential, I think I can risk saying all the essential services now have water storage. We see it in the, I believe, soon to be open geriatric hospital. I believe that the water storage in the, I hope, soon to be open fire station. Sir, the QH has, I believe, about at least 4 days of water storage, potable water storage. And the other geriatric hospitals also have water storage. The prisons have water storage. So I congratulate the government on the background work it's been doing to make sure that while they're not things that will get you votes, there are things that are essential and they are being done in the background and will benefit all. Sir, the matter of resilience was tackled in the last budget, where householders receive help in having storage tanks for potable water. I believe that while that in itself is probably a good thing, I sometimes wonder if we have a storm or a hurricane, if people will be able to access the same water that they've been storing, and what effect it will have on the electrical grid when you turn on all those pumps together. But that's a matter for the technocrats to solve. Now, there have been visible improvements, sir, in our stormwater infrastructure. I have noted that in Whole Town, whereas in the past, if one spat uphill from Whole Town would flood. It no longer happens, but it's not yet been fully tested. So I wait for it to be tested. We have a good downpour that lasts many hours. We will see what happens then. You can't solve everything. The Constitution River improvement has certainly helped the QEH. So the car parks no longer flood, and I believe the Accident Emergency Department does not have to leave as it used to. It still has its own flooding problems, but I'm told that those have been resolved. There was no specific mention of gullies, Mr. President, in this legislation. And I wondered why. And it is because a large amount of the stormwater and the water runoff heads to the gullies. Some gets back into the groundwater supply, and I believe most of it gets into the sea. The level of, I believe the amount of garbage that used to go into our gullies has reduced. I believe so. I do frequent the gullies, and I no longer see as much as I used to. I don't frequent the popular ones. So I don't think there's as much garbage as you. So maybe Bajans are listening, and the government's help to move your garbage, people no longer need, particularly in the rural communities, to throw it into the gullies. I couldn't help but note, Mr. President, that the penalties on summary conviction for breaking the law as laid out in this bill, when it becomes an act, are significantly smaller than for obstructing access. And I wondered why. That someone can pour a toxin into an area where there's a water course and might get fined $20,000. But if you stop someone, the inspectors, from coming on your property, you get fined $50,000. That, to me, sir, does not make sense. Because they can come freely, find it, and you get fined. But if you stop them from going, you get fined $50,000. Maybe the lawyers can explain that. Now, Mr. President, this bill, if it passes and is proclaimed and it becomes law, makes it incumbent upon developers to, one, submit, well, developers who have developments beyond a certain size as laid out, to submit stormwater drainage plans, have them passed, and also to construct the stormwater drainage. And it speaks about penalties for what you're required to do in terms of the frequency of maintaining the wells. And I've noted that there's no There is no limit in terms of time or how long a developer must maintain the drainage wells. I thought that when, and maybe Senator Thompson, when she speaks, will clarify some of these things. When a developer does a development, and it's not a gated development, eventually the government takes over the road infrastructure and all such things. And I would like to believe that government therefore takes over, certainly where I live, takes over responsibility for the drainage. But if the infrastructure that was supposed to have been put in was never done properly, the burden falls on the government then to fix it later on. So the people who are charged with doing the drainage inspections need to be, one, significant in number, do their jobs and be beyond reproach. You cannot have a man measuring an 8-foot well, sir, with an 8-meter well, sir, with a tape where the first 3 meters are missing. So when he passes a well as 8 meters, it's only 5 meters. So the people who up front are supposed to make sure that the inspections are done have to do them honestly. And those who are supposed to follow up have also to do them honestly. Sir, lastly, I want to speak a little bit, sir, about what happens when you don't follow up. There is a place in Christchurch, sir, I think it was in your former constituency, where over a number of years, contamination of the groundwater occurred because of an undiscovered leak in aviation fuel. There have been financial settlements to a significant number, given to a significant number of those affected in the agricultural sector. But there's never been a plan issued for cleanup. So agriculture continues, but the petroleum is still in the ground, and we have become silent on it. Sir, what it means is that government, when it discovers that there's contamination, particularly of water wells, and the water wells in Gibbons where the farmers use for irrigation, needs to, one, notify the public and make sure that whatever remedial action has to be taken is taken. Now, the government correctly has taken many steps to protect our water supplies. And I have to come back, sir, to something I've said in this parliament before. We have lost track of what used to be our water wells. And I know that the BWA has been trying to locate the old water wells, the wells that were used either for, I guess, bucket dipping, or they were driven by windmills. Their water's pumped by windmills. Development, sir, has happened in most of the areas, housing development, where these wells used to be. And I believe, sir, that the wells are not being used for the former use. I believe, sir, that rather than taking from the wells, we are putting things into the wells. And what we are putting, sir, is raw sewage. So while on one hand, on the surface, we are bringing legislation to stop people from doing something, we have an obvious existing problem, or I should say a potential problem, that we have not been successful in clarifying. There were over 480 water wells in this country in the 1940s. And so far, I am told that we've only been able to locate less than 125. The wells did not disappear. So we have to ask, what are we doing? Could we possibly be making the situation worse by putting sewage into those wells, and we do not know what is happening? So I call upon the government to encourage whichever department is supposed to do it to get on with it. Because on one hand, on the surface, we're fighting one battle, and then we're adding to it, sir. Sir, before I close, I want to encourage the government once again to please be the ones up front in speaking about secondary water use. Do not let the naysayers be the ones who have the podium. Or if they do get on the podium, you have to drown them out with the truth. This country is a water-scarce country. The cost of water continues to rise. And since Senator Cummings is here, and I saw, sir, in the printed media, I think on Sunday, on the front page, they were speaking about 90 billion, I think it was. Yeah, on the back page. That is to be invested, or needs to be invested, in the green energy sector. I like to believe, sir, that there's a big chunk somewhere in there where green energy, sir, and water are connected. So that while we might not be able, as a country, to bring down the current price of water, we could probably, sir, for the next 20 to 30 years, keep it from rising. So that some of the problems that happen in the Thames Water Authority will not happen here, sir. We will not survive it. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Speakers, Senator Andre Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I stand to support this important piece of legislation, Mr. President, not only for all of the reasons that the colleagues before me have outlined, but because I think it fits quite nicely into the tapestry of environmental legislation, the attempts at resilience building, and the crafting of sustainable frameworks that this government has engaged in over the last 7 years. And all of that, Mr. President, is aimed at protecting Barbadians, ensuring that Barbadians have greater protections, greater help as we contend with the vagaries of climate. No doubt, Mr. President, some of the marquee interventions have included debt for nature and debt for climate swaps, a blue-green bank, and perhaps the most seminal of all of them, the continuous advocacy of the Honorable Prime Minister as she calls for fairer financing and faster liquidity on the international stage. And no doubt, sir, the legislation before the chamber is connected to all of that work, because this legislation, this stormwater management bill, is really aimed at ensuring that protections are crafted for the people of Pike Corner, for the people of Parish Land, for the people of Passage Road, as we contend with the vagaries of climate. speakers before me have indicated just how acute the issues of climate have been and how in the last couple of years we have become victim, I suppose I can say, to greater flooding, to more extreme weather events, and we appreciate that that has dire implications for us as individuals, for businesses, and ultimately for our economic sustainability. And that is why I think that this intervention by the government of Barbados is critical. As you have heard, the bill does a number of things. It assigns duties to landowners and occupiers and developers. It creates a system for inspection and for the declaration of flood zones, Mr. President, and it, of course, ascribes a set of penalties and creates a system for cost recovery in relation to negligence and the like. More than the particular provisions of the bill, Mr. President, I think that this legislation before the Chamber today provides a degree of clarity about how we should treat to the management of our stormwater systems, where responsibilities lie, and ultimately crafts a system of certainty that we can all depend on. But further to that, Mr. President, I think it inspires this provision, this bill, inspires a sense, or should inspire a sense of environmental responsibility among all of us. Because the legislation in its various provisions really speaks to all of us, whether we are occupiers, developers, business entities, or the average citizen. And it should compel us to consider, if we have not already, that which we do in relation to the environment matters. Previous speakers have indicated, Mr. President, the plight of litter, the issues of litter and dumping and illegal dumping, Mr. President, and the challenges it creates for stormwater management and for just the general cleanliness of the country. And so I was pleased to see that contemplated in this legislation are penalties in that regard. But, Mr. President, the legislation is but part of a broader effort to, as I indicated, towards environmental protection and towards sustainability and resilience. And while there is collective responsibility for all of us, perhaps I will take a significant portion of my remarks today to talk about the business sector. Because I think that while there is responsibility for all of us, there has to be increased responsibility, increased cognizance of the effect of some operations, Mr. President, on the environment and on our sustainability. And no doubt, I was happy to see the provisions in the bill that speak specifically to developers who have projects over a certain size. But I put it to you, Mr. President, that businesses of all sizes should not only be considering stormwater management systems and stormwater management infrastructure, if indeed that is necessary, but that this has to exist in the context of broader environmental planning. I say this because in light of our reality, I think too many businesses consider or make environmental considerations only when they're required to do so by law, when they're required to do so by the prescriptions of our planning and development legislation, Mr. President, which are often at the pre-construction and pre-construction and pre-operation phases. And there is no evidence of sufficient consideration as time goes on, as construction begins, as production begins, Mr. President. And I really think that as we consider this legislation today, we should consider the extent to which it is but one part of a significant set of interventions and a significant set of considerations that our business community should take. A brief diversion, Mr. President, to say that the planning and development legislation that prescribes the need for EIAs in some regard provides an extensive list. But certainly as we contemplate other types of enterprise, as we contemplate high energy tech solutions or agro-processing or agro-industrial products and projects, Mr. President, perhaps we ought to also contemplate making some amendments to that legislation. All of that to say, sir, that the considerations of stormwater protection must exist in a broader framework that includes water conservation, that must include waste water reduction, that must include energy efficiency. And that when we plan environmentally, that we must include the stakeholders, the persons who live next to and proximate your businesses, those who are impacted by your enterprise, Mr. President, not just at the pre-construction and pre-production phase, again, but at all phases, because we appreciate, Mr. President, that the climate crisis that we consider today is not the climate crisis, or is not the set of climate realities that we considered 5 and 10 years ago. That is to say, Mr. President, that there are a set of variables that change, and that interventions and considerations ought to be consistent in that regard, so that to do it only at the level of your pre-construction or pre-production phase is not as efficient as perhaps we would hope it to be. All of this, Mr. President, all environmental planning at the level of our businesses ensures a greater degree of resilience. It ensures a greater degree of sustainability for our businesses. There are studies that say to us that environmental considerations and environmental and social management mechanisms make economic sense, and that particularly for countries like ours, Mr. President, for whom economies are not large and for whom 1 or 2 days or a month of shutting your business has real life implications for the people, for you, for the people who work for you, and for our entire community and society, Mr. President. So that I think it is time that the business sector take a more holistic approach to the notions of business continuity, to the notions of environmental planning, and that what has sometimes been the traditional adversarial approach between business and those who live in the community, that we take another look and a better view and greater steps towards incorporating the interest of all in that regard. Mr. President, when taking a look at the legislation in relation to enforcement, I wondered about manpower capacity. And I certainly wondered if technology was not one of the ways that we can ensure that this legislation is adhered to. Perhaps as the regulations come to be and persons operationalize the provisions as developers, for instance, make good on the building of infrastructure or the crafting of stormwater mitigation plans, that is there not room for a greater role for technology to ensure that entities are doing what we want them to do? This is, of course, out of a recognition that there's only but so much manpower. And we have big ambitions in this country, and we have big work to do, but we have to find ways using technology and to ensure that it is most effective and that it is done and that it is sufficiently enforced, Mr. President, because, like we have all said, the static provisions are fine, but whether this legislation functions in the way that it ought to or not has real-life consequences for many a Barbadian. Mr. President, I wish to close by commending the government of Barbados, by commending the civil servants who contribute to ensuring that in a swath of legislation, environmental sustainability, resilience are continued considerations. Our track record tells us that these are, in the span of development, Mr. President, environmental considerations are relatively new. And these individuals are, in some instances, treading a road not well trod before them. But such is the nature of this country's ambitions, such is the nature of this government's commitment to the continued protection of Barbadians, Mr. President, and I must congratulate them for that. Sir, I think that this piece of legislation before the Chamber is an important piece of legislation for inspiring in all of us a sense of environmental responsibility, a sense of caring about our neighbor, a sense of resilience as we contend with a set of realities that we cannot always plan for, Mr. President. And it is on that basis that I give my full support to this legislation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andre DuBois. Senator Reverend Charles Morris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to all my colleagues here. Before I go into the substance of my presentation, let me join the chorus in congratulating our former colleague here in the Senate, Chad Blackman, the Honorable Chad Blackman, first let me congratulate him on his success, his overwhelming success in the just concluded by-election in St. James North. I am particularly happy at his elevation to the lower house. But I'm happy, sir, because the Honorable Blackman and I were both appointed together in diplomatic positions. We returned to Barbados at the same time. We were appointed and sworn into the Senate at the same time. It seems that fate has it. It seems that fate has it that either I should follow him or he should follow me. And I'm sure that that would not be a good bell for persons like the senators on the other side, the opposition senators in particular. They would not take that too kindly, or they would not be too happy. But I wish the Honorable Blackman well. I have all confidence that he will do well, and with the task that is before him, I'm sure with God first, he will succeed. Mr. President, also, I wish to offer my prayers and care and concern for our colleague, Senator Malilu. I learned of it today and this accident today, and I offer him and his family my prayerful support, and I pray that God's grace, his faith, his own faith, would give him the courage to deal with the challenges that he will face at this time and that he will face in the future. Mr. President, I must confess that I never knew too much about storm water management. I never knew too much about climate change until recently. And in preparing for this discussion today, or debate today, I did my research and I depended heavily on the ethical stance taken by Jonathan Sachs, and then all the information provided by Jeffrey Sachs. And I must begin by complimenting and congratulating the government on ensuring that we have this discussion, or that we have this bill to deal with, so that we can chart a proper future for Barbados in terms of climate resilience. The funny thing is, sir, that this thing called water, I mean, some persons were told that water is life. We can't live without it. But that which is life can also take our very life. It has also become a force of destruction. It has caused us dearly. It threatens our agriculture. And there's so many areas that it continues to affect us. And I'm sure that you would have heard Senator Cummings in her opening remarks deal with all the ways in which it has affected us. Flood our homes, erode our environment. All of these things, sir, we can suffer because of water. And it forced me to look back into theology. to look back into the story of creation, to look back into the Psalms. And I noticed that in those stories, mankind or humankind, whichever term you use, was supposed not to dominate the environment, but to have dominion over it. But there are certain elements in our world that have taken to dominating our environment, and because they have taken that stance of domination, it is having a deleterious impact on our environment as well. We are supposed to protect this environment. We are supposed to care for this world. And that is what I assume and have concluded that this legislation is asking us to do, to be once more, to have dominion over this land and to care for it. So therefore, sir, it is not a matter of if we need to act. It is how urgently we must act, we must do so. And I'm saying to you, sir, that it is a matter of urgency. Because, as I said, the very thing that is supposed to give us life can easily take it away from us. And it seems as though that even though I'm dealing with it, we are dealing with it now, and a lot of people are dealing with it now, it seems as though it has been around for a long time, because each year we are witnessing severe storms and rainfall. You know, there was a time when the rain used to drizzle and give you a little warning that it was going to fall. Now it is coming down one time. One time, just so. And so it is impacting on our drainage system, it's impacting on our urban and rural systems. The ecosystem is suffering. Therefore, it becomes necessary for us to have adequate storm warning management. Climate change has intensified. And in fact, every year it seems as though the hurricane season is beginning earlier and earlier. Once upon a time, flooding was something that was very, very rare. And now it is occurring with increasing frequency. What about our infrastructure? A lot of it is aging. In fact, we have also impermeable surfaces, flooding again. In rural areas, soil erosion. As a matter of fact, someone mentioned this morning when we had the cuscus grass on the hedgerows of the fields. That is no longer there. So soil erosion, destroying arable land. We know what happened last year with Beryl. We know what happened years ago. As a matter of fact, sir, these days when I hear about hurricanes, and when I hear the wind blowing or hear it blowing in Barbados, I always try to console myself by saying, well, I can understand this is not bad, given the experience I had in Jamaica some years ago. I've not yet seen that kind of impact here, but yet whatever we have, it is still having a negative impact on our country. Stormwater management is not just about water, though. It is also about quality. Because of the pollutants that the water can drag in, that it can discharge in oceans, that the negative impact it can have on For example, the Graham Hall Sanctuary that we just opened. So our society stands to be threatened and continue to be threatened by the impact of the climate problem we're having. So therefore, it means that we have to create modern systems as well to deal with this impact of flooding so that our water management, the way we manage this water, would be successful. And I'm saying that I support this legislation simply because we must invest heavily in storm water management. If we do not, all the economic gains that we have, all the social activities in which we take part, all of these will be threatened. The first time I've learned about bioswale and all of that is I've learned that. And the importance of these things. So therefore, we must invest heavily in them because cleaner water, healthier ecosystems are important for us. So I learned about green roofs, yes. I learned about wetlands, I learned about all of these things. And I've realized the threat that our society faces by the impact of these hurricanes, the rain that goes into the ground to recharge aquifers. All of these now appear to be threatened. And therefore, I believe the government must be commended for acting and acting in time. Because I believe that if there's one area that we can save, in fact, I can have this bill attempts to make our economy stronger. Because we'll have to spend some money, but the question is, if we spend the money, what are the benefits of it? And therefore, the bill addresses something not just for now, but for the future. And I am confident that there are going to be more and more amendments from time to time because the impact will always get worse. So if we do not spend the money to protect our environment, at some stage we may have to spend it and spend more. So as we try to close the gaps between what happened and what can happen, and avoid what can happen, I believe that this legislation has gone a long way in trying to keep our society safe from the negative impacts of our environment, that what the hurricanes and such like can have on us. So I believe that this legislation, sir, should be supported by all. I realize that the opposition did not have too much to say against it, but I believe strongly that this is a time that we seize this opportunity, invest wisely in stormwater management, let us lead boldly, and let us make stormwater not a problem to be pushed away, but a resource to protect. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Reverend Charles Morris. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension of the sitting of the Honourable Senate for lunch at this time to reconvene at 2:15 in the afternoon.
The question is that the Honourable the Senate is suspended until 2:15 p.m. today. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye.
Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This sitting is accordingly suspended until 2:15 p.m. today.